Welcome in to the College Football Podcast. We are back after a brief hiatus there, the peak of the off season, but we have media days in the rearview mirror. Fall camps are opening all around the country. 23 days here on July 31st. We are 23 days away from the start of the season, week 0 in the forefront. We have some previews to get to, though. I'm going to start with this episode. We're going to preview the Southeastern Conference. Going to do each of the major Power Four conferences, just the Southeastern today. Not going to be every team, but just the ones you're going to want to hear about. So stay tuned for that. Going to kick things off with this preview episode down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. LSU. Last season, quick summary, you went 9-4. Not the season that everyone was hoping for. You won your bowl game. This year coming into 2025, your over-under is 8.5. Now, when I look at LSU and I look at their schedule up and down, worst case scenario, I would say 6-6. Don't take that as that's my prediction. I am not predicting 6-6 for LSU. I just think in a world where all of the worst case scenario, don't need to explain what that is. 6-6. Ceiling 11-1. They're a team that has a wide margin of variability. A lot of outcomes I can see when you look up and down their schedule and you think about the matchups that they're going to be a part of this year. A lot of range of variability. The expectation for LSU is simple, and that is make the playoffs. I think an SEC championship berth or victory would obviously be welcomed, but making the playoffs is the goal numero uno there in Baton Rouge. And for Brian Kelly, who has set expectations lofty this year, saying that this is the most talented roster he has ever had there at LSU. Key games that you're going to want to look forward to, obviously week 1 at Clemson for LSU. That is a big talking point around Baton Rouge, not winning that week 1 opener. They've got another tough one this year there in Death Valley. Florida, you get them at home. You go to Ole Miss. You get South Carolina at home this year. Frankly, I think that you should have lost that game last year if you're LSU. You got some help from the black and white stripes there on the field. But let's be honest, you did win the game still. But if not for them, I'm not so sure. You get Texas A&M at home. That series has been home and home for years now. The last 6 or 7 years, the home team has won. I don't necessarily expect that to change. You go to Bama. While you got them year 1 under Brian Kelly, they have stomped you for the last 2 seasons, and you got to go to their place this year, and you wrap up with at a trip to Oklahoma. So big swing games that could go really either way. You can win. You can beat all those teams. You can lose to nearly all of them because I think a lot of them match up talent-wise, with you. The defense is still kind of a question mark, although I expect it to be, I expect the progress to be showing up on the field this year. It still has not happened since they started that overhaul and brought in Blake Baker. I will be honest, I'm not much of a fan of the Garrett Nussmeier narrative that's out there, and that's not to say that he's a bad quarterback. It is to say, however, that I don't think necessarily, and I'm not an expert NFL draft analyst, but talk about him going round 1, pick 1 in next year's draft, I think is a little lofty, especially with what he showed last year, which was, yes, a lot of flash, but also a lot of problems. Whenever he was pressured, he was not just not helpful, but at times detrimental to the team. So he obviously has arm talent, but it doesn't always, it's not always enough. At least it wasn't last season to carry that team over the finish line. Obviously, if you progress, you get better. Teams don't stay stagnant. Last year's results don't equal this year's results, but you did lose some key pieces on that O-line who didn't necessarily live up to their expectations last year, in my opinion. So it's going to be, a little bit of a challenge for them to mesh there, him to get warmed up this season, and he doesn't have much time to do it there at Clemson. A little bit of talk about how this is kind of a pre-hot seat year for Brian Kelly. If he doesn't get it done, they go 8-4, have that type of season again, miss out on the playoffs. Patience there is starting to wear thin. So other than that, not much left to get into the preview on LSU. We're going to do a prediction episode here in the next couple of weeks. But with that being said, let's move on down the road to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. 2024, you also went 9-4. 2025 over/under is 9.5. Alabama has similar. I'll say, how would I say this? There's not quite as wide of a range of outcome, I think, when you're talking about Alabama, but it does exist in some respects. 9-4 last year. I'd say your floor this year is 7-5, ceiling 11-1. Again, 7-5 would be worst case scenario. In this scenario, Ty Simpson, the new quarterback, is just not panning out. Maybe the defense doesn't quite, take a step forward or perform at the level that's expected in Tuscaloosa. I, however, am pretty high on Alabama this year with the wide receivers that they have, with the O-line that they have. I think that Ty Simpson and the whole team is just set up for success this year. The expectation, conference championship playoffs, it's Alabama. That's what the expectation there is. That's kind of what the whole country, for the better half of a decade and a half has penciled them in as. Obviously, Nick Saban is gone, but a lot of talent still remains. A good coaching staff replaced him, and that administration is not, they're not going to skip a beat if they can help it. Key games to look forward to, obviously, your week 1 matchup at Florida State. You got to go to Georgia this year. Tennessee at home, at South Carolina. You get LSU and Oklahoma at home this year. You go to Auburn to finish the year. This is kind of a scenario where you can, if you look at each game, each opponent individually, you can make an argument that Alabama is going to win. But when you look at the whole schedule collectively, and it's going to be this way for a lot of teams this season, not sure that they can get the job done all 12 games. Obviously, that's the case most of the time. Not everyone goes undefeated. Kalen DeBoer, his squad, they did recruit very well. They're returning a talented bunch. They're going to be competitive and hard to beat in every game. I have high expectations this year, which we'll get into more as the season nears and my prediction special is made and released. Moving on to Athens, Georgia. Last season, 2024, in case you were under a rock, they won the SEC. They made the playoffs. However, they did lose to Notre Dame. Gunnar Stockton came in, obviously, in that SEC championship game when Carson Beck went down. Played in the playoff game. Over/under coming into 2025 is 9.5. Worst case scenario, 8-4 for Georgia. I'd say your ceiling is 10-2, which may seem low to some, but I think we need to adjust our expectations and how we think about success record-wise in college football. Conferences are getting bigger, more competitive. You have Texas and Oklahoma and the SEC now. Obviously, Southern Cal, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and the Big Ten. There's not enough wins to go around like there once were. That combined with the transfer portal, NIL, other teams, they are able to pick off your top-end talent like Texas Tech, and their big boosters like Cody Campbell are able to, they're able to recruit and pay the players that you once were. So the lines are blurring. Competitive balance is emerging, relatively speaking. But the expectation this year for the Bulldogs is a deeper playoff run. The SEC championship, you're always expected to be in the mix for that. But I think what fans in Athens really want to see this year is a deep competitive playoff run. I'm not saying you have to win a title for the season to be considered successful, but you need to make some noise in the playoff. You have some pretty big games that, it's going to be tough. So you got at Tennessee, you got Alabama, at Auburn, you get Ole Miss at home, Florida, obviously at the neutral site. You get Texas at home this year. You play Georgia Tech again, who sent you to 7-8 overtimes last year. That Alabama game used to be Kentucky. That Texas game used to be Vanderbilt if you're Georgia. And so your schedule, it's ramping up. It's a lot harder than it once was. Gunnar Stockton, all eyes on him coming into the season. How is he going to progress as a quarterback? Is he going to be able to take Georgia where they want to go. Stetson Bennett, for example. Not to dog on Stetson Bennett, he was obviously a great college quarterback, but I don't think was ever really in the conversation as, an elite quarterback, but he was just what Georgia needed at that time. They obviously had some big targets like Brock Bowers, Loud McConkey to throw to, who are now tearing it up in the NFL. The biggest thing with Georgia, while you did bring in some ball catchers, you got Zachariah Branch, you got Noah Thomas in there now, but your running game, what is going on with your running game? Whenever you recruit like Georgia does, especially along the lines of scrimmage, and you recruit skilled positions like they do, there's really no excuse for them to not have a good running game. And they were one of the worst. They were like 15th or 16th in the conference last year rushing the ball. So that needs to improve. If you want to help take some pressure off Gunnar Stockton, you need to run the ball this year. Conference and playoff contender, obviously. How much help is Gunnar Stockton going to get? Again, he's got better targets to throw to this year. They just need to they need to be more balanced. Obviously, you're able to pull out some gritty wins. You did it last year against Texas. You were able to grit your way through it. I don't know that form of play is, it's not going to carry you. It's not necessarily sustainable. They're always going to be a gritty team, but you can't rely purely on that grit to take you as far as the Bulldogs want to go. Coming into 2025, how much of that grit is going to have to carry you compared to, just the Jimmies and Joes, I would say. Moving on a little south, Gainesville, Florida. We'll get to DJ Lagway on this. So last year, you went 8-5. Honestly, there seems to be more, it almost feels like there's more hype around Florida coming into this year than there is Georgia, and Georgia won the conference last year, but that's what a strong finish will do for you. However, they did finish 8-5. Their over/under win total this year is 7.5 coming into 2025. The floor is still relatively low though, because you have a tough schedule at 5-7. I would say that's the floor. Your ceiling is probably around 9-3, and that would be an insane 9-3. So the expectation in Gainesville, it's not 5-7, so you need to probably go, and it's not, the expectation isn't where it probably should be for Florida, but 8-4, 9-3, somewhere in that ballpark. At least they need to show progress. They need to show that Billy Napier is a coach that can progress the team, that can grow. He needs to show that he can turn them into the program that they expect to be. Your key games at LSU, it's going to be tough. It's early in the season. At Miami, you get Texas at home. You go to A&M this year. You got Georgia, obviously. You got Tennessee and Florida State at home. All of those games, aside from Florida State, maybe Miami, Tennessee, those games I would say are probably toss-ups, but I would lean to the opponent whenever you're talking about LSU, Texas, and Texas A&M and Georgia. Billy Napier, how long is his leash coming into this year? If they have a bad start, what's the vibe around Gainesville going to be? How much patience are they going to have to let him work his way through this season? DJ Lagway is, obviously a big part of this. A lot of concern around him. He was, he got injured last year. He had a recurring thing with his shoulder. He wasn't able to throw a lot, through spring and the start of this season, or not this season, but earlier in this year. Even now, going into fall camp, he's got I believe it was a calf injury. He's been walking around in a boot. So, injury prone is starting to become a talking point around him. The time will tell if that's fair or not, but he needs to make it through the season healthy for this team to have the success that they want and need. How do they start? I would love to know. Do they start 2-2? You start with Long Island and South Florida. I'd say you should win those games, although South Florida is not going to be, a cupcake. And then you have LSU and Miami. So if you start the season 2-2, how do we view Florida? Like I said, and how long is Billy Napier's leash? How does that pressure mount? How does it build? You're 18th in returning production, so you've got some carryover. You got some, development that can carry over. You've got some continuity there, so that works in your favor most of the time. But really, I hate to make the talking points around one guy and that guy being the quarterback, but in this case, DJ Lagway, that's the biggest question. That's the biggest key for success in Gainesville this season. All right, time to get into those boys in Norman. 2024, you went 6-7 last year, obviously falling short of expectations. And the way you did it was not pretty. Pretty chaotic year, especially offensively. Coordinator gets fired, quarterback leaves, obviously. Your over-under coming into this year is not very bright. You're at 6.5 on the over-under win total. Floor, 5-7. Ceiling, probably 8-4. Again, like Florida, really tough schedule. The expectation there, similar, 8-4, 9-3, showing improvement. We need to see that, especially on the offensive side of the ball. If they could be, competent offensively, they're going to be a really dangerous team. I think that them being a factor in the SEC championship race, maybe not, directly competing for it, but knocking off a team who's, looking that way, like Texas, for example, will do you a lot of favors if you're Brent Venables. Week 2, you got Michigan coming into your place. Very excited for that game. That may be one of the games I'm most excited about all year long. You got Auburn. You have Texas at the neutral site. You go to South Carolina. Tough place to play. Same at Tennessee, at Alabama. You get LSU at home. This is by no means a cakewalk. Part of the reason why the over-under is 6.5 and the ceiling I have is 8-4 is because of this. John Mateer, another offseason, another Washington State quarterback transferring out to save a program down south. Last year it was Cam Ward. This year it is Oklahoma. How does he incorporate into Norman and the SEC? His offensive coordinator coming with him. Venables is... I tend to think that there's more patience around him than fans and, the narrative will lead you to believe. Being as good of a defensive coordinator as he is, he seems like he's a good coach. Maybe a little raw in the head coaching department, but it seems like he has potential to be a high-level head coach, and I think they see that there and maybe won't pull the trigger on making a change as quick as some may have you believe. I'm excited to watch him. The defense should be nasty. I kind of wish that my team played them. Kind of wish they didn't because, like I said, they're going to be a tough out no matter who you are. But tough schedule. Really looking forward to watching Oklahoma this year. And speaking of Oklahoma, your former quarterback Jackson Arnold, now down at Auburn, who finished last year 5-7. The over-under coming into this year is 7.5. What is the expectation around Auburn? I would say probably similar to Oklahoma. You need to show progress. 8-9 wins. Haven't met that expectation yet. They also, recruiting is starting to become a concern there. They need to sign a good class. Probably, they're probably outside of the realm of signing a top 10 class at this point. But I would say if you could get that to, top 20, then you're going to do yourself a lot of favors, especially if you have a good season. But if you come in and you are struggling this year like you have before, it's going to be really hard to sign a good class. The wheels can come off this thing pretty quick, unlike Oklahoma, where I think there's more patience for Brent Venables than you would believe. I don't think that's the case at Auburn. I think the patience there is pretty thin, and if you don't start strong or have a good year, I think that Hugh Freeze is probably going to be the former head coach of Auburn by the end of this season. Similar to Florida, but not as extreme. The quarterback here is going to be key. Jackson Arnold, he needs to deliver for Hugh Freeze. They've got some great guys to throw the ball to. Your key games this year, you go week 1 at Baylor, who I expect, like a lot of people, to be highly improved this year. That's not going to be, that's a very losable game is what I'm trying to say. You also go to Oklahoma, you go to A&M, you got Georgia and Alabama on the schedule. So you can lose all those games, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That puts you at 7-5 if you lose those and win all the other games. that there's not, there's other losable games on the schedule, but these are key if you want to have success. I would say starting week 1 with a win, obviously, that always goes a long way. It kind of, settles you get kind of jittery, a little concerned maybe, you get excited, but there's always, at least if you're the fan of a team like mine, you're always excited but a little worried about what the season brings. So if you can go into Baylor and win week 1, that's going to buy you a lot of goodwill, but it will evaporate quickly if you stumble as the season continues. But speaking of stumbling, Ole Miss last season, it's hard to say a team that went 10-3 stumbled, but they were all in on the playoffs last year and they missed it, losing some games that should have been wins like Kentucky. Still going 10-3 is a big accomplishment there in Oxford. Their over/under win total coming into the season is 8.5. Ole Miss, I'd set the floor about 7.5. Not 7.5. 7-5. Ceiling 9-3. The expectation for Ole Miss, in my eyes, is a little murky this year. I would say that if you're, a diehard Ole Miss fan, you want to see them make the playoffs, but I think you may be a little hesitant. Obviously, you're going to talk a lot and be hyped about Austin Simmons, but I think you may be a little hesitant to go as far as to say that we're making the playoffs this year, because the team that you have this year is definitely not as good, especially on the defensive side of the ball, as it was last year, and as we know, you fell short last year in that department. I think that this is kind of an in-between year for Ole Miss. You need to recruit a little better, bring in some, more key pieces through the transfer portal once the season ends to give you a better shot next year, since that's how they recruit there. But I would be surprised if they made the playoffs this year after missing it last year. You got Tulane on the schedule. That will be a cool game. I always like when SEC and good G5 teams meet. You play LSU at home, at Georgia, at Oklahoma. You play Florida. Not a murderer's row, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be easy. You're not going to be able to sleep through it. Lane Kiffin, obviously, always good with quarterbacks. They're, always good offensively. I wonder if that falls off itself too there this year. Just a touch falls off. They did have a first-round pick at quarterback last year. Is Austin Simmons going to be better than that? If you're, listening to a diehard Ole Miss fan, they'll probably have you believe that, but he may be better, once his career has progressed and he comes to the end of his college career, maybe he tries to go to the NFL, he may turn out to be better. But as of right now, it's hard to say that he's going to be better than Jackson Dart, who, like I said, went through in the first round of the draft. But things are going to be interesting this year in Oxford. I don't expect them to make the playoffs. They're going to be a factor, as in they're going to challenge teams that are competing for the SEC, but I don't think they're going to make the conference championship either this year. Like I said, not necessarily a down year, but just kind of a in-between transition year. That's something about Georgia, too, to touch back on them for a moment. Just kind of, it seems like maybe a transition year, but we can dig into the dirty details of that later on as we get closer to the season. Moving on to College Station, Texas. Texas A&M. 2024, you finished 8-5 with a loss to USC in your bowl game. 2025 over/under win total is 7.5. I have the floor set at 6-6 for the Aggies. Again, like the other teams, that's worst case scenario. I don't necessarily see you going 6-6. The ceiling I got in the 9-3, 10-2 range. I try and be precise with these, but sometimes it's like, 9-3 or 10-2 as the ceiling. Those are both very plausible to me. I'd say the expectation record-wise is at least 9-3, mostly to buck the Texas 8-4 narrative, but 9-3, be a factor in the SEC race, can make the playoff. That's kind of where we're at in College Station. You got Notre Dame week 3. You go to them this year. You get Auburn at home. You get Florida at home. But you do play at LSU, where you haven't won since, I believe, the 90s. And you go to Texas to finish the season. I think it will be fun if that, I always like whenever those rivalry games, the home and home rivalry games, are kind of, the wins are flipped to where the away team wins. I think that's kind of funny. I like whenever that happens. But for LSU and A&M, it's always the home team. For Texas and Texas A&M, I wonder if they can set that precedent this season. But those are some of your your biggest games. You still got to play, Missouri, some South Carolina. Kind of a dark horse conference contender here, I would say. Maybe not. They're always talked about, so it's hard to say that they're a dark horse. But I think that they, you know, again have a legitimate shot. Playoff contender, of course. Marcel Reed, how has he progressed? There's a lot of talk around him or the offense. Like, I don't think people remember whenever you think of A&M last year. You kind of tend to think like, oh, they kind of struggled offensively. They didn't. They were first and they were number one in scoring in the SEC. They did not struggle moving the ball offensively. At times they did, but overall, from a top-down view, they were good on the offensive side of the ball. It was the defense that let them down in that Auburn game, in that USC game. If the defense played competently, if the secondary played well in those two games, we'd probably be talking about a 10-win team from last year. But woulda, coulda, shoulda. You dropped those games because the defense played terrible. Auburn, they took, they pushed them into overtime. The receiver drops the ball in the end zone in overtime to lose the game. That's not on Marcel Reed. Marcel Reed led them down the field in that bowl game with less than 2 minutes left to score and take the lead, and then the defense gave it right back. That's not on Marcel Reed in the offense. The offense and him at quarterback, they played well enough last year to be a contender, and they played well enough to be a 10-win team. Like I said, it was the defense. So don't sleep on them offensively coming into this year, because they've got better players at wide receiver, at the skill positions. They've got a healthy Le'Veon Moss coming into fall camp. They've got a healthy Reuben Owens, who got hurt last year in fall camp to start camp. Mike Elko says that everyone on their team is healthy and fully available starting camp. Of course, Casey Concepcion, Mario Craver, two big pieces at wide receiver there. You also have Terry Bussey, who's coming back and will be playing full-time at wide receiver. Veteran O-line is what the Aggies have. Elite running backs. Returning production, first in the SEC, sixth in the country. So you're returning a lot of pieces from a team that was one win away from the SEC championship last year. I think the coaches that are there now are better coaches than the Jimbo era. They're better at developing just overall culture setting. I think that you can see an absolute step forward this year, and I would not sleep on the Texas A&M Aggies coming into the season. I know everyone makes jokes. They're kind of like, I get a similar vibe talking point around Penn State, where, yeah, they do okay every year, but they don't beat the big teams. They don't win the big games, and that's mostly been true-ish. They win big games here and there, but ultimately they don't tend to amount to the overall goal or expectation. I feel like this season, I wonder about next year for them. Maybe, whenever a lot of the pieces on the O-line are gone to the NFL, whenever, some of these transfers that have come in to contribute have been, taken to the NFL through the draft. I wonder if next year is going to be more of a transition year. It's, time will tell. We're still seeing how this recruiting class plays out, but they've done a decent job recruiting. Top 10 classes. I say decent. They've, signed top 10 classes since the new coaches have been there. So I wouldn't sleep on them this year. I'd fully expect the Aggies to be a contender whenever you're talking about the playoff and the conference championship, at least through October. As David Nuno at TexAgs likes to say, they put the no in November last year, so we'll see if they can change that coming into 2025. And to wrap up the individual team previews, we will go up the road to Austin, Texas. So obviously, last year in Austin, you lose to Georgia in the regular season, you lose to Georgia in the SEC championship game, but you make the playoff. You go to the semifinal game for the second consecutive year, but you drop that one to Ohio State, the eventual national champion. Coming into this year, you're over-under pretty lofty at 9.5. I'd set the floor at 7-5. Again, worst case scenario, 7-5. Ceiling is 11-1. The expectation in Austin and for the Longhorns, frankly, is to win a national championship. But if I were to put it in more reasonable words, back-to-back semifinal game appearances, you need to at least make the title game, make the playoffs. They would like to see an SEC championship trophy be lifted at the end of the year. but really the national title is the ultimate goal there this year. However, they did not play a super tough schedule last year. It's flipped this year, but with the way that teams progress year over year and the home field advantages change, you do play a bit of a tougher schedule this year. Obviously, with week 1 at Ohio State, you go to Florida this year, and so long as DJ Lagway is healthy, that is not going to be a easy game, and you can very well lose that one. Oklahoma, I know you think they're down, but for the better part of the last decade, they've had your number, and Oklahoma can absolutely beat you this year. Georgia at Georgia this year, by the way, they beat you twice last year, and Texas A&M at home. I'd probably lean you to win that game, but again, the Aggies are not going to just lay down and let you roll. So a lot of tough games this year. You could get bit by Arkansas, who you play after Georgia, by the way. Vandy tried to get you last year. They almost did, but you were able to survive that. So returning production is the biggest concern. Now, obviously, recruiting at the level you do, reloading is always what you expect or hope for. But you are 103rd in returning production. So you have a lot of new players coming in to fill key roles that have lofty expectations that they didn't necessarily earn on the field. It was the previous team, Quinn Ewers, some of the guys from the team last year and the year before that kind of raised the standard there back to where it should be, set the expectations high. You have new players coming in to fill the role that they played, and they are coming in with expectations elevated, even though they were not the ones who actually earned those expectations. So how does that play out? Obviously, the biggest thing around Texas, for better or worse, is Arch Manning. How is Arch Manning going to do? I think similar to Nussmeier, obviously the Manning name, that's always going to get you a lot of attention. That combined with, a big brand, that's, the attention, the hype, it's very understandable. However, on the field, it has not been earned. And that's not to say that he's going to be a bad quarterback. It's just to say that he has not contributed on the field to earn any of that hype. It is all, kind of media created from his name, which is fine. But he needs to earn it on the field this year, especially if they want to win a national championship. So Arch Manning is going to have to, he's got some big shoes to fill, not necessarily that Quinn Ewers used to be wearing, but that have been essentially created and set down in front of him. There's a lot of obviously expectations around him. Number 1 in Heisman odds. It's going to be somewhat insufferable here and there throughout the season, depending on how he plays. But he does need to perform well. He wasn't exactly lighting things up whenever he did come in, and he played some lower level competition last year. Again, I don't expect him to be bad. He's probably developed the ideal way that you want a quarterback to develop. He's been there, he's sat, he's waited, watched, learned. He's developed in silence, behind the scenes. Not silence, but, off the field, silence-wise. And I think that he is as ready as any quarterback could ever possibly be to come into the, to fill the starting position. So I have, not high expectations or hopes, but I think he's going to do well. It's just a question of how well. Is it 9-3 well, or is it, national championship well? Time will only tell. They're obviously a contender for the conference and for the playoff. I'm very happy to be back recording podcasts. By the way, it's been a couple weeks, but we are back in full swing. I have a lot of plans for this season. So if you like the podcast, go ahead, follow it, subscribe on YouTube, follow me on X or Twitter, however you like to refer to it. But I will wrap up this episode with just a quick top-down view of the SEC as a whole. I've got your Tier 1, kind of the favorites in the league. Obviously, Bama, Georgia, Texas. There is seemingly kind of a vacant spot, maybe in Tier 1, for someone in Tier 2 to jump up and grab. In Tier 2, I've got, the contenders. I've got A&M, Tennessee, and LSU. I think, a little lower on Tennessee, but A&M and LSU could absolutely step up this year and jump into that Tier 1 category. I've also got your dark horses listed as Florida, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. Florida and Oklahoma, big wild card teams. South Carolina just depends on if they can kind of continue on the success they had last year. But those are your dark horses for the conference. If I'm buying and selling teams, I'm probably going to buy A&M, Florida, Oklahoma, and LSU. Um, Teams that aren't in the tier one, like the obvious. Like obviously, I'm buying Bama. Obviously, I'm probably buying Georgia. But aside from the obvious, those are the teams that I would say buy stock in. If I'm selling stock, I'm hitting the dump button on Auburn, South Carolina, Ole Miss for this year, Tennessee for this year, and I'm dumping on Missouri stock wise. Gonna sell there. I think that those teams are gonna be, transition years, just kind of beginning. I think Missouri could be on the precipice of a rebuild. Probably didn't say that right, but by the way, if you can hear chewing in the background, I do have a dog in here with me chewing on a rawhide, so just ignore that. But Missouri, I think you could be at the. Oh, there she is. Could be, at the start of a rebuild. Tennessee, I think you're kind of in transition. Same with Ole Miss. South Carolina, I'll lean more rebuild wise, especially after this year. I think you're gonna go dark for a little while. And Auburn, I just don't have a lot of faith in Auburn. Maybe they'll prove me wrong. I don't have anything against Auburn. I actually, they're a really good atmosphere, a really good place to play. They can be really good at football if they want to be, but they just haven't been that for quite some time now. I would say 6 teams are probably in the overall mix for the playoff as having a legitimate shot. We could probably get 4 or 5 teams out of the SEC in the playoff this year. There is a high level of parity potential, I would say, because we haven't seen it yet. So right now it's just potential. But while I do have a kind of a tiered category, there's still not necessarily a clear separation, especially with one team. There's not an elite team yet. If we get one, we're obviously not going to know until the season is underway. But right now, there's not really a team that jumps out as elite. If you want to look at the current conference title odds, Texas is favored at plus 290, followed by Georgia at plus 300. Bama in 4th place at plus 460, and LSU comes in at 4th at plus 650. A&M, after it's a big jump to A&M, who's next in line at plus 1400. So those are your conference odds. If you want to look at national championship odds, well, Texas, here we are again, number 1 in odds at plus 600, followed by Georgia at plus 650, who is tied with Ohio State. But that's your top 2. Bama is down the list at the 6th spot at plus 1100. So that's kind of what the odds, picture is showing us right now. But make sure you follow the podcast, like I said. Leave a 5-star review. Subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on the socials. I will be releasing another preview next week. Actually, 2 next week. So just late this week, it's Thursday. Next week, I'll have 2 for you. And then I'll have another one with the week to follow. And then I will wrap that up before the start of the season and actual game previews with my prediction special. So until next time, thanks for listening.